Hello, how's everybody going? How's everybody doing? Welcome back to the live broadcast. Finally, after 5 weeks offline, your instructor is finally back with the live lectures. My voice is a little bit rougher, and you can probably tell I've lost a bunch of weight. It has been a tough 5 weeks, but I am so glad to see you folks. Hello, Omar. Good to see you. Thanks for making it. I know you have to leave a little early. Matt, it's good to see you. Yasmin, Kira, Ariel, Fawn, Luke. Man, it is great to see everybody. I hope you're doing well. I sure did miss you. Holy cow. It's been the craziest 5 weeks you ever could imagine. It has been the toughest thing. They told me it was going to be difficult, but holy cow, was it difficult. I actually fasted for almost a whole month. Didn't eat a single thing for a whole month and lost 35 pounds. Holy cow. I'm finally back, just started eating solid foods this weekend. And I'm hoping that I'll start gaining some of that weight back. My throat's a little bit rough today, so I'm going to do the best I can. If you can't hear me, please let me know, and I'll try to lean in closer to the camera. Okay? I know, right? 35, and I was not a fat guy to start with. I was kind of skinny. So I actually haven't weighed this little since I was in 10th grade of high school, if you can imagine, Matt. So, hope everybody took care of the exam last night. Thank you very much. You folks have done a great job in my absence. I've noticed you've been doing your homework, your discussion boards. You've been absolutely fantastic. 98% of you turned in the course evaluation, which is very, very impressive. Thank you so much for your good work this semester. I am really, really impressed. And good morning to you, Bola. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into Chapter 13. Okay, so the next couple of weeks we're going to be talking about the self, personality, and problems that occur with the self and personality. So we're going to talk about the self and personality this week, and then we're going to talk about psychological disorders and their treatment for the next couple of weeks. For this week's discussion board, I want you to take a personality test and talk to people about your personality scores. This is what I consider to be the most reliable and valid online personality test on the internet. So please take this test and let's see what your personality looks like. I think you'll have a lot of fun doing it, and I'm pretty sure I posted my personality scores too, so you can see what kind of a nut job your teacher is as well. Okay, so this week we're going to talk about self and personality. So we're going to talk about personality today and Wednesday. We're going to talk about defining the self, what exactly this thing is, the self, how the self develops. That's what we're going to talk about today. And then on Wednesday, we're going to talk about how we can reliably measure important aspects of the self. Now, if you remember in Chapter 7, we talked about schemas, right? And we said that they are knowledge representations that help us organize information about concepts. I think I may have even used the idea of a schema of a circus. And I said, what's a circus? What comes to your mind? And you said elephants, clowns, tigers, a tent. You know what? Your self is the same stinking thing as any other schema. So just like you have a schema for a fire truck, you have a schema for school, you have a schema for the circus, you have a schema for yourself, which is a set of beliefs that you have about yourself. So really, yourself is just the beliefs that you have developed over the course of your lifetime about who you are. Keep in mind, these self-beliefs can be accurate, and they can also be inaccurate as well. So I don't know if you've ever met someone who is a depressed personality, a depressed person, and they may have what looks like a wonderful life on the outside. They may look like a strong person, an intelligent person, a person that has it all, and yet they may tell you that they're a loser, that they're ugly, that they have all of these failures. And you know what? If that person believes it, that is their reality. So yourself is a set of beliefs that you have about who you are that help guide your behavior. And these beliefs may be accurate or inaccurate. I hope that makes sense so far. Now, personality, which is a form of the self, is the relatively stable set of thoughts, emotional responses, and behaviors that characterize a person. It's that quality that causes two people to respond differently to the same stimulus. I don't know if you've ever been out anywhere and had a waiter maybe take a long time to bring you your food, or somebody not give you the service at a store that you thought. And for one person, that's no big deal, and they don't care, and they take it all in stride. But then the person that you're with gets bent out of shape and uptight and very angry. And the way those two people differently respond to the same situation determines your personality. So some of you may be anxious personalities, some of you may be laid-back personalities, some of you may be angry personalities, some of you may be happy personalities. So your personality is just your characteristic way of responding to environmental stimulation. Why is personality important? Well, it allows us to understand our behavior and the behavior of other people. So, by knowing my personality, I've allowed myself to maybe I try to put myself in situations where I will respond in a positive manner. You know what? I'm a neurotic personality. Neurotic people tend to get either anxious or angry. And I'm an angry neurotic. I lose my temper relatively easy. You know what? I didn't know that until I took a personality test at 35 years of age. I thought everybody else was the problem. But I took my personality test and I turned to my wife and I said, "You won't believe this. This test says I'm neurotic and angry." And my wife started laughing, and I'm like, "Why are you laughing?" She's like, "Because you are." And it was the first time in my life where I realized I was an angry person. Now, knowing that about myself, I try to put myself in situations where I can respond most effectively, and I try to avoid situations that are going to make me angry. So knowing about personality allows you to organize your own behavior and to respond to different situations appropriately. And you know what? Knowing about other people's personality allows you to respond to them in more effective manners. If you know that Bob is a neurotic person and gets really angry, there are some things you may or may not share with Bob, or you may choose your words carefully when you're around Bob. On the other hand, if you're with a person who has a laid-back personality, you learn that you don't have to worry as much about how you respond. So personality is very important, and you know what? It also allows us to predict the future behavior of others. My wife knows when I'm going to lose my temper, and she tries to organize her way around me in order to keep me from losing my temper. I hate to say it, but my wife is good that way, and she takes care of me. And she knows when Chris is going to blow his top, right? And we're going to talk about 3 broad approaches to personality. We're going to talk a little bit about what the self is today, and then we're going to talk about some classic theories for how the self develops. And then on Wednesday, we're going to talk about measuring this thing called personality. So let's go ahead and move on. As I suggested to you earlier, we all have this thing called a self-schema, which is a set of beliefs you have about yourself. If I asked you to take out a piece of paper and describe yourself in 10 sentences, each and every one of you would be able to describe yourself. I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. You would talk about your concrete abilities, so I'm a good athlete, you might want to know. I'm from Mobile, Alabama, which is where I come from. My social identity, I would tell you that I'm a Phillies baseball fan. I'm a UNC Tar Heel, woohoo! I'm a North Carolinian, woohoo! Which is my social identity. I'm a male, white. Those are also aspects of my social identity. And then I might tell you I like to read, I like to work out, and I like to cook. And those are sort of activities. And all of those things represent my self-schema. Now, it turns out that there's a lot of information about each and every one of you, but some of you, but most of us only focus on a limited subset of who we are. So I have lots of things about me, lots of things that go in my self-schema. But you know what? I only access a subset of those at any given time. So when you think about Chris, Chris is mostly thinking about being a psych professor and mostly thinking about being an athlete. So that represents my working self concept. That's the aspects of myself that I'm currently thinking about. So, and you know what? Depending upon the given situation, my working self-concept, different aspects of my self-concept may be activated. So when I'm in the kitchen, I'm thinking about Chris, the chef. When I'm on a baseball field, I'm thinking about Chris, the athlete. When I'm in class, I'm thinking about Chris, the teacher. And so my working self-concept is whatever happens to be occupying your mind and defining yourself at any given moment. Now, some people may have positive working self-concepts. Other people may have negative working self-concepts. So some of you may be depressed or have low self-esteem. And that's because you choose to access negative aspects of who you are in any given situation. So some people chronically access the negative aspects of their self, and they may have low self-esteem. On the other hand, I like to focus on the positive aspects of myself as a general habit. And so that may mean that I have high self-esteem, right? Now, if you look over at that chart on this, that I have, this 10 questions, this is the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. This is a 60-year-old scale that's used to measure people's self-esteem. And basically they ask you these 10 questions, which is sort of a global evaluation of yourself, and they ask you to evaluate yourself. I invite all of you to take the Rosenberg self-esteem scale and measure your self-esteem. And if you look right below me, this represents an example of a self-schema. Any questions so far? I can't see you, so I don't know if this all makes sense. Okay, I'm assuming you got it. So, now, as I suggested to you, we can access different parts of ourself at any given time. And as a general rule, most people try to maintain a positive emotional state about themselves. Most people do. Now, people who are diagnosed as depressed probably don't do that as much, but most of us attempt to maintain a positive sense of self at all times, right? Now, your book's going to talk about self-esteem in this thing called the sociometer hypothesis. This fellow named Mark Leary from Wake Forest suggests that self-esteem is actually sort of a metric which allows you to determine how accepted you are by your group. It turns out that being a part of a group is not only a fun thing to do, it's actually very useful. And if you think about humans as being pack animals, right? Humans aren't very strong by themselves, but when we get into groups and work together, we increase our ability to survive. So there's an evolutionary value of being a part of a group. And this guy, Mark Leary, suggests that self-esteem exists in order to allow us to determine how accepted we are by the group. And he argues that people who feel more acceptance from the group have a higher self-esteem. And so he argues that we use our self-esteem as a gauge to tell us whether or not we need to change our behavior. If you're feeling bad about yourself, it's because you've done something to make yourself less positive within the group. And he argues that that allows us, our low self-esteem allows us to know, hey, maybe it's time to change my behavior to fit in better with the group. So this guy, Mark Leary, argues that self-esteem acts as a sociometer, allowing us to determine how accepted we are by the group. Now, high self-esteem. You know what? It turns out that high self-esteem does not make you more successful. And it turns out that a lot of people who are in prison have really high self-esteem. So self-esteem doesn't necessarily make you a successful person. It's just a global evaluation of how good you feel about yourself. However, high self-esteem does act as a buffer against frustration and failure. I don't know, some of you probably give up on things easy. When you meet failure, you say, oh, I'm not going to do that anymore, I quit. People with high self-esteem tend to persist in the face of frustration and failure longer than people who don't have high self-esteem. So you can think of high self-esteem as maybe a way of judging how much you fit in with the group, and it also maybe protects you against the effects of frustration and failure. Hello, Whitaker. It is good to see you. Thanks for showing up for class today. Now, here's the deal. An interesting thing about human beings is most of us have a much more rosy view of ourselves than we really should. Most of us exist in sort of a deluded state. We have what are called positive illusions about the self. And here's the crazy thing. Ask 100 people, how good looking are you? And you know what? Those 100 people are all going to say, better than average. If you ask people how good a driver they are, most people are going to say, better than average. If you ask people how smart they are, most people will say, better than average. So it turns out that most people tend to think they are better, smarter, good looking, and intelligent, more intelligent than they really are. And this is called the better than average effect. Most people tend to overestimate their own individual qualities. Crazy piece of research. It turns out that people who are diagnosed as clinically depressed tend to have more accurate self-views than people who are not clinically depressed. So it turns out that most of us have this positive illusion where we feel better about ourselves than we actually are. That's sort of a state of being healthy, if you will. Now, it turns out that most people also have what's called a self-serving bias. When you're successful, most people like to take credit for it. When people fail, they like to push the failure off on their group members. So I play baseball, right? And when I get a hit and have a good day playing baseball, I say, wow, boy, I am a great hitter. I am a great hitter. So I talk about how I impact my ability. Man, I'm such a great hitter. But when I get up and have a bad day at the plate and get struck out 3 times, I say, wow, that pitcher was really good. That pitcher was good. That pitcher was good. So what most people tend to do is they take credit for their success and they push their failures, the credit for their failures, onto other things. And that allows us to maintain a positive feeling about ourselves. And most people, when they make comparisons, they like to compare themselves with people who are less good at whatever the comparison the dimension is. So I like to compare myself to the guys who aren't as good looking as me. I'm much better looking than Dale. I'm much smarter than Marty. I'm much better athlete than Fred. So most people love to engage in downward comparison. It boosts our self-esteem. And so most people, especially people who are not diagnosed as clinically depressed, like to engage in strategies to boost their sense of self-esteem. The better than average effect, self-serving biases, and downward comparisons. Hope that makes sense. Now, if you look right underneath me, there have been lots of gender comparisons of self-esteem and longitudinal comparisons of self-esteem over the lifespan. And one of the crazy things you're going to find about self-esteem is that it differs between males and females. Now, a lot of you females are probably going to laugh at this because you know that most of us guys run around like prancing cock-a-doodle-doodle roosters talking about how great we are. And you probably know that most guys tend to be egomaniacs and that we think we're great at this and great at that, and most guys like to brag about stuff. It turns out that starting about puberty, what we're going to see are gender differences in self-esteem, where males tend to have much higher self-esteem throughout the lifespan until we get into late adulthood. And who knows, this might be why maybe sometimes men tend to have more vocational success. It's because we tend to feel more confident about our abilities and ask the boss for a raise, whereas you as females may not feel confident enough to go for the raise or the promotion. The guy is always going to do that because he has this overabundance of ego and self-esteem. Any questions so far? Good morning, Sandy. Good to see you. Yes, I am feeling much better, Whitaker. Not 100%, but I am feeling much better. Okay. Now, let's talk about personality development. One of the biggest traditions in psychology is what we call one of the biggest traditions in psychology is studying how personality develops. And in chapter 13, they're going to talk about 3 broad theories which focus on how personality develops. So how did you develop the personality that you have? The low self-esteem personality, the high self-esteem personality. How did some of you become narcissists? How did some of you become neurotic people? How did some of you become open to experience? There are 3 broad traditions in the study of how personality develops. And these are some of the oldest areas of research in psychology. If you remember at the beginning of the semester, I told you about a fellow named Sigmund Freud. And we haven't mentioned Sigmund Freud throughout the entire semester. Well, here's where we talk about Sigmund Freud and his psychodynamic theory. Okay? Now, we talked a little bit about Abraham Maslow and the humanistic approach to personality several weeks ago. We're going to talk about the humanistic approach to personality development today as well. And then I'm going to talk briefly about the social cognitive approach. Now, each of these approaches can be expanded out, and I could talk for weeks about each of these approaches, but I'm going to only do about 10 minutes on each of these 3 approaches. We don't have a lot of time to talk about them, but I sort of want to introduce these 3 ideas for studying personality. Now, the psychodynamic theory suggests that personality is based on conflict. Okay, it's a conflict-based model, which suggests that personality develops because human beings have desires that run counter to the rules of society, and we have to learn how to manage this conflict, and this conflict creates our personality. The humanistic approach argues that human beings are like acorns growing into oak trees, and your personality will develop into a wonderful, happy, fully functioning personality unless there are forces in the world which impair your personality development. And then the social cognitive approach is based on the behavioral tradition, and it suggests that we learn through positive and negative reinforcements personality styles that then affect the way we behave for the rest of our life. So according to psychodynamic personality develops out of conflict, and most people have broken personalities. According to the human personality, we will all develop into happy, healthy people as long as we have the right environment. And the social cognitive approach focuses on how operant and classical conditioning create our personalities. Am I making sense so far? Everybody following along? If you're following along, give me a little feedback in the chat bar. Let me know that I'm making sense. Ooh, boy, this throat's feeling tough today. Okay, fantastic. Okay, great, Yasmin. Great, Whitaker. All right, so Sigmund Freud and intrapsychic conflict, the psychodynamic approach. Now, Sigmund Freud was probably the first personality, he was the first personality psychologist. He was the first developmental psychologist, and he was the first person to really have a unified theory for how people develop. Now, his theory was wrong in a lot of places, but he was sort of, he was a forerunner, and he was a an inspiration, and he was the first person to sort of develop a complete theory for how people's personality develop. And he developed an approach that came to be known as the psychodynamic approach. Psycho, which is psyche, going on in your mind, and dynamic, there are dynamic forces moving around. So he thought that personality evolved because we had this psychic pressure, and that it engaged in dynamic processes, conflict with the external world. And he was one of the first rock star psychologists. He was world famous. A lot of people loved him, a lot of people hated him. But he was the first psychologist that was universally famous. All right. Now, he began his research in the late 1890s, the late 19th century, and he was studying people who developed what was known as hysteria. That was primarily seen as a female problem. Now, in 1890, hysteria, some people, hysteria is now called somatoform disorder, but sometimes people have psychological conflicts and it causes them to develop physical problems that have no physiological cause. So you might lose the ability to speak. You might lose the ability to move a body part. So you might develop the inability to move your arms or your legs. Some people become blind, and there's no organic cause for these problems. These problems are psychological in nature, but these psychological problems cause these physical problems. Now, in 1890, it was called hysteria, and it was thought that this occurred only in women, and it was thought that it occurred because their uterus started wandering around their body. It was called the wandering uterus hypothesis. And Sigmund Freud got a lot of grief because he published a paper where he argued that men could also suffer from hysteria. Now, you all know why this would have been a crazy theory back in 1890, and it's because men didn't have uteruses. But Sigmund Freud thought that there was sort of a psychological reason for this disorder, and it was not physical. Now, he thought that, of course, at first, he began to develop this theory because he thought that this theory was rooted in sexual shame. All right. He argued that all human beings have this sexual energy we'll call libido, okay? And all human beings have this desire for sex. But he argued that when we grow up, we learn that there are rules about how we can express our sexuality. And he argued that the conflict between our sexual desires and the rules of society that tell us we should be ashamed of sex cause conflict. And if we don't learn how to resolve this conflict, this causes psychological problems. Now, he argued that human beings have three parts of their personality. We're born with this thing called an id. Now, id is German for it, all right? And he argued that this was our animalistic, instinctual nature. And you know what? All animals have a sexual instinct. And it makes sense, right? If we didn't have a sexual instinct, we wouldn't have babies and we wouldn't be able to procreate our species. So we all are built with an inborn sexual instinct. And he gave the term for this sexual energy, he coined this term called libido. And I'll bet some of you have probably heard the term libido. That is a Freudian term. Now, he argues that we have this libido, and your book talks about the process. He argued that this libido moves around in our body the first 10 years of our life because we don't have mature sexual organs in order to express our sexual libido. All right, and he argued it moves from our mouth to our anal region, and then finally to our sexual organs. I'm not going to ask you about that on the test. I just want you to know that he argued we have this sexual instinct, and it's inborn into us. And all of you have a sexual instinct that drives you even now. I promise it. Right? Now, he argues that, and this is the part where people think Freud's a little weird. He argued that starting about the age of 5 or 6, we develop our first sexual attraction. And you know who we develop our first sexual attraction for? he argues we develop our first sexual attraction for our opposite sex parent. Okay? He called this, and he argued that we developed this thing called the Oedipus complex. We actually called it the Electra complex for females, but the Oedipus complex for males. We develop a sexual attraction for our opposite sex parent. But you know what? That is a really taboo thing. And he argued that this sexual instinct that we feel for our opposite sex parent causes us to feel very, very ashamed. Very, very ashamed. And he argued that this causes us to develop a conscience, or what he called a superego. And whereas our id is filled with libido and only wants to fulfill its desires, he argues our libido is our restraint mechanism. It's our sense of shame that we feel for having this sexual instinct. And I'm sure all of you have felt a sexual instinct or felt an impulse that makes you feel ashamed or embarrassed of yourself, right? And he argued that your id and your superego are against one another, okay? Now, if you look at the picture right underneath me, he argues that both of these structures, your id and your superego, hey, take care, Omar, I'll see you on Wednesday. Tell your father I said hello, okay? So he argues that our id and our superego, our sense of shame and our sense of sexual drive, are actually below our level of consciousness. So I don't even know why I feel the desires I feel. And I don't even know why I feel the shame that I feel. Okay? But he argues that these two things are in conflict with one another. And he argues that we develop our personality, or what he called our ego, or consciousness, as a structure that's trying to manage the pressure between our id and our superego. So your ego's job is to fulfill the desires of your libido without getting in trouble from your catching hell from your superego, right? So we have these desires, but we have to find a way to fulfill our desires without feeling bad about ourselves. So he argues the ego, which is your conscious personality, develops, and it's a structure that simply tries to manage the pressure between our id and our superego. Now, he argues that this conflict builds up and builds up and builds up during the day, and we can't fulfill all the desires we have. But he argues that what we do at night is when we fall asleep and we dream, our superego goes to sleep and sort of relaxes itself. And he argues that we dream about the desires that we have. And he argues that our body doesn't know the difference. So that when we dream about these things, we sort of release the pressure of our id. We release this libidinal pressure. How many of you have had dreams about things that are kind of embarrassing? Maybe you have dreams about the limitations that you have. Maybe you disappointed your father or your mother, and you have dreams about these things. Now, I remember my dad really wanted me to go into the military, but I didn't want to go into the military. But I felt bad about my desire to avoid the military and my dad's desire to have me go to the military. And so when I went to sleep at night as a teenager, I would always dream about joining the Navy. But for some reason, I never seemed to make it up the gangplank onto the boat. And the boat would always sail off without me. And I never managed to make it into the Navy. But I always had these dreams about joining the Navy, but missing the boat. And Freud would say that this dream was allowing me to express my lack of interest in joining the Navy in the face of my dad's desires for me to join the Navy. So do you see how we sort of dream? Now, sometimes you may have had a sexual dream about a friend, or maybe even, God forbid, a family member. And you may have even woken up being embarrassed about that dream. But Freud says that's okay. What you're doing at night is you're releasing this libidinal pressure so that it goes away and you wake up healthy in the morning. Because the superego is never going to let you express all the desires that you have. Now, he argued that our personality develops as a result of the pressure between these two competing personality constructs. Now, he argues some people have desires that are so embarrassing, that are so locked away, that they can't release them even at night. And so Freud developed this theory of what he called defense mechanisms, which he argued are ways in which we lie to ourselves to release the pressure caused by this conflict between our id and our superego conflict. Now, he argued that most of these defense mechanisms were problems. And when you went to Freud, he would have you work on releasing your defense mechanisms. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Sigmund Freud, but his famous piece of furniture was a couch. And when you went into Freudian therapy, what he would do is he would have you lay on a couch and relax yourself. He would turn the lights down low, and he would sit behind you so that you couldn't see him. And he would just sit there and let you start talking. And he argued that if he sat there long enough, you would start talking about the things that were bothering you on your own. Now, he argued that most people repress their desires. They don't talk about them. And he argues that what we do is we forget about them on purpose. And he argues that repression is like the number one defense mechanism. What we do is we forget about the things that are really making us ashamed. And when we do this, we repress these desires, okay, it makes us feel a little bit better. And so what he would do is he would have you lay on the couch and you would start talking. And after a while, your desires, your libidinal desires, would break through this defense mechanism of repression, and you would start talking. So you would lay there and you might say, you know what, I'm really mad at my father. And he would say, oh, really? Tell me about that. And you would suddenly, this desire that you had been repressed would break through into conscious awareness. And he would get you to start talking about that. Now, he argued that repression was the number one way that we dealt with, number one defense mechanism for dealing with this unresolved conflict between our personality structures, right? But he argued that we would express this conflict in lots of different ways he called defense mechanisms. Now, here's the deal. If you'll see this chart right here, these are some defense mechanisms by which people manage the anxiety that their unresolved desires, manage the anxiety of their unresolved desires. Now, I'm going to talk about them briefly, and I may ask you to identify examples of them on the exam. Let me tell you about denial. My mom was a heavy smoker. She smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day until she died. And she was heavily addicted to cigarettes, and the cigarettes were taking her breath away, and she had trouble breathing. Now, it turns out when you quit smoking cigarettes, the first thing your lungs do is they heal themselves, and they start coughing up all the soot and the tar that you have in your lungs. And my mom used to tell me this lie. When she'd quit smoking for a couple of days, she would start coughing and her lungs would start healing. But she would go back to smoking because she couldn't stand the desire. She couldn't help herself. She had to smoke. Now, and she would lie to me, and she would lie to herself by saying, you know what? When I quit smoking, I start coughing. And so smoking keeps me from coughing. My mom would actually lie to herself and tell herself that cigarette smoking actually made her healthier than it really did. Can you see how she was sort of denying the obvious? And so my mom went through this denial. She would refuse to acknowledge that cigarette smoking was killing her. In fact, she sort of came up with a lie that she could suggest that cigarette smoking was actually good for her. Now, here's another defense mechanism. Sometimes people feel bad about a desire or an impulse that they have, but they can't deal with that anxiety, so they actually suggest that somebody else has that same desire. Have any of you dated a boyfriend or girlfriend who accused you of being unfaithful to them? Any of you ever done that? A lot of times they'll do that because they are actually cheating themselves and they feel badly about it, but they can't admit that. So they actually suggest that you are doing that. Okay? Now, have any of you seen a person that is very, very homophobic and they really, really don't like gay people, right? Sometimes people do that because they feel a little bit they are afraid of their own homosexual tendencies. We would call this reaction formation. Sometimes people have a desire and it causes them to feel anxious, and what they do is they flip that desire around and turn it into its exact opposite, and that's called reaction. Back in the day, Ryan, yes, but my mom lived in a time when she knew cigarettes were bad and she still couldn't admit it. She still couldn't admit it. I remember I was friends with a high school teacher several years ago. Well, I'm still friends with him. And all he used to do was talk about how mad he was that his high school females dressed in short skirts and tight clothes. He was very, very angry at you young ladies. Can you believe that? Look at that sexy clothes. Look at those tight skirts. They're just showing their ass. Can you believe that? And he was so angry at you females, you young girls, for dressing seductively. Now, was my friend, my old mad friend, really angry at you females? No, he was actually very, very sexually attracted. But he couldn't deal with the shame of that feeling, so he flipped it around and pretended he was angry at you. That's called reaction formation. Okay? Now, I'm going to skip down to the last one, is sublimation. Freud suggested that all defense mechanisms were problematic, with the exception of sublimation. And he argued that sometimes people take this libidinal energy that they can't get rid of, and they turn it to other activities where they can get this energy out. And he argues that sometimes we channel our socially unacceptable libidinal energy into constructive, even admirable behaviors. So people build businesses, people write books, people do artwork, people do lots of things. And he argued that all these activities, these productive activities that we engage in, are what he would call sublimated libidinal energy. Because I can't engage in this sexual impulse, I turn that libidinal energy into something that is positive. And so he argued that what you'll see is a lot of people develop really weird ways of lying to themselves, and defense mechanisms are just ways in which you lie to yourself. And he argued that these lies that we tell ourselves occur because we can't manage the anxiety caused by our libidinal desires. So do you see how Freud's argued that personality really was a function of conflict between our libidinal desires and the rules that prevent us from expressing the libidinal desires. Now, according to the humanistic approach, personality is not caused by conflict. Personality is actually developed. People will develop normal, healthy, happy personalities if the world lets them. So if you think about it, you have DNA, which determine how you're going to turn into a human being. And all of us grow into normal human beings unless something in our environment poisons us. He argues that personality is the same way. Just as an acorn will grow into an oak tree if you water it and give it light, human personalities will turn out normal as long as they're given water and light. And he argued that all human beings have what he called the self-actualizing. This guy, Carl Rogers, argued that all human beings have a self-actualizing tendency. That is, we will turn into the person we were meant to be, whatever that is. Some of you may be an artist, some of you may be athletes, some of you may be thinkers, some of you may be homosexual, some of you may be heterosexual. And he argued that we will turn into a healthy version of our authentic self if the world allows us to, and gives us what he called unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard. Now, I'm sure some of you have probably had parents who don't like aspects of you. They don't like the fact that you wanted to be an English major. They don't like the fact that you wanted to be an artist. They don't like the fact that you hang out with these friends or that you're into sports, right? How many of you have had parents who make you feel bad about things you like? If you have parents who are giving you conditional positive regard. So sometimes parents tell you that they don't like aspects of who you are and they want you to change. Some people who are homosexual grow up in a world that doesn't accept homosexuality, and they have to lie and pretend that they are straight when they are actually not straight. And Carl Rogers argued that these people live in a world of conditional positive regard. That is, you are only worthwhile if you live this way and do this thing. My father wanted me to be a military leader. I didn't want to be a military leader. My dad wanted me to go into computers. I didn't want to go into computers. So my dad set up conditions of worth for me. And he made me feel like I wasn't valuable unless I wanted to do these things he wanted me to do. And what Carl Rogers argued is that sometimes we have two senses of self. We have our self-image, which is how we really view ourselves, and we have this ideal self, which is what other people want us to be. Now, if people give you unconditional positive regard and tell you they like you no matter how you are, your ideal self, that is the self you ideally want to be, and the self you are will remain close to one another, and you will have congruency in your personalities. But if you get a lot of conditions of worth and people tell you you have to do this and you have to do this, your ideal self and your actual self-image will separate out, and you will develop incongruence, and you will develop into an unhappy person. Exactly, Sandy. Your parents wanted you to be one thing and you wanted to be another. And we all feel guilt because we are making these people unhappy. And he argues that mental illness and personality problems occur when we exist in worlds of conditional positive regard instead of worlds of unconditional positive regard. And so one of the things that Carl Rogers tried to do was he tried to provide people with unconditional positive regard and allow them to understand that who they were was an acceptable person. And it didn't matter what other people said about you. It's what you feel like you need to be. Okay? And so the humanistic approach argues that if you'll just let people grow into what they want, their DNA, their self-actualizing tendency, will grow them into a normal, happy, healthy person. And mental illness isn't inevitable. So according to Freud, defense mechanisms, psychological problems are the norm. We're all going to have these psychological defense mechanisms. But according to Carl Rogers, if people just accept you for who you are, you will develop without psychological problems. Okay? Now we're running out of time. Now, Albert Bandura is the social cognitive approach. He was interested in where confidence comes from. And he studied people who had trouble getting rid of problematic behaviors. So why can't you quit cigarettes? Why can't you do well in school? How come you don't have the confidence to engage in correct behaviors? And he argued that people learn personality styles through early reinforcements and punishment. So if your parents tell you you're good at things, you will develop not only, if your parents put you in situations where you can do good things and get positive reinforcement, not only will you continue to do those things, but you will develop a sense of confidence. If you're brought up in an early childhood where all you meet is feelings of failure and all you meet is failure and you're never successful, not only will you not engage in these behaviors, but you will develop a negative personality style. You'll develop low self-esteem. And he argued that this model is what he called reciprocal determinism. Not only do we learn to succeed and fail, but we develop our personality based upon that. So our environment creates personality factors, which then creates our behavior. So some people don't even try to go to college. And you say, why don't you try to go to college? They're like, well, because I know I'm not a smart person. Well, how do you know you're not a smart person? Well, I didn't do well in school back in the day. So he argues that the environment can create personality styles in you, which then changes the behavior. You've probably had friends that were great athletes but didn't try out for the team because they didn't feel good. You probably had friends that could have been doctors but didn't go to medical school or college because they thought they were stupid. You probably had friends that were very good looking but never tried to have a boyfriend or girlfriend because they didn't feel good about themselves. Right? And so he argued that this reciprocal determinism can create feelings of what we call self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the feeling that you can do something successfully, right? And so some of you have high self-efficacy. Can you pass my class? Of course I can pass your class, Chris. I'm a smart person. Can you pass a biology class? Yes, I can pass a biology class because I have high self-efficacy. Some of you, on the other hand, think that you're a failure, think that you can't pass my psychology class. You think that you can't pass biology class. There's no way I'm going to ask that person out. I'm not good looking enough. You have low self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is your belief in your ability to engage in a course of behavior to achieve an outcome. Now, this develops through early experiences and is domain specific. So we have relationship self-efficacy, you have vocational self-efficacy, you have educational self-efficacy, you have social self-efficacy. So you may think you're a good student but bad at work. You may think you're great in making friends but bad at school. And so self-efficacy, it's now self-esteem is a global feeling of how good you think you are in general. Self-efficacy is a very domain-specific belief, and your thoughts on your abilities. Can I do this? Can I do this successfully? Okay? Now, Bandura researched what kinds of things affect your self-efficacy. And he found that there were 4 basic things. The first is doing tasks successfully. So here's the deal. If you're trying to develop a child with high self-efficacy, you have to put them in situations where they can be successful. Now, if you put them in situations where they always fail, they'll develop low self-efficacy. If you don't ever give a kid a chance to try something too, and you spoil them and don't give them a chance to make their bed or struggle, they won't develop high self-efficacy. So you have to put your kid in situations where they can struggle and be successful. Now, he argues also another thing that affects our self-efficacy is watching other people be successful. If you've ever seen somebody else do something and they achieve it, that gives you a sense of confidence. So you watch your friend jump into the pool and swim and you say, wow, Johnny did it, maybe I can do it. So vicarious success, seeing other people succeed, is a good way to build high self-efficacy. Now, if your parents tell you you're good at something, that will help you build high self-efficacy too. But more importantly, social persuasion can destroy self-efficacy. So if you've ever had a parent tell you you suck at something, that is a really good way to destroy somebody's sense of high self-efficacy. So be careful. Try not to be negative to your children, because when you tell them that they're bad at something, they really believe you and they develop low self-efficacy. And also, he argued that we feel our emotions, and that gives us a clue as to whether or not we're good at something or not good at something. If you've ever gone in to take an exam and your heart is beating out of your chest, what you usually do, remember we talked about Stanley Schachter's 2-factor theory of emotions? A lot of times we read our physiological emotions to come to conclusions about how we feel. And what he argued is that when we're over nervous, we begin to believe that we're not good at something. And so he argued that learning how to manage your emotions can also help you develop feelings of high self-efficacy. And so one of the things that athletic trainers do in trying to help athletes develop feelings of self-efficacy is teach them how to manage their emotions. And if you keep the heart rate down, you'll feel more confident about your ability to engage in an activity. And so next week or 2 weeks, when we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, what we're going to talk about is how therapists use feelings of self-efficacy to help people overcome their psychological disabilities. So if you have anxiety that prevents you from going into social situations or causes you to develop a phobia, what I'm going to do as a therapist is to help you work through your feelings of low self-efficacy by using these four ways of impacting self-efficacy. Do you have any questions? I've gone over again today. I'm sorry, that's too much to talk about. Thank you very much for coming. It's been great talking to you. I've missed you. I look forward to being back on Wednesday. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. Have a great day, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Take care.